The briefing room on way station Kavath smelled like recycled coolant, and whatever the Sorth delegation had eaten for lunch. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the holographic manifest they'd thrown up on the center projector, a rotating schematic of my ship, the Perseverance, docked in Bay 11, while I sat at the far end of the table and watched them laugh at it. Not politely, not diplomatically. They were laughing in Sorth, which is a low, rhythmic clicking from the back of the throat, and I'd been stationed in this sector long enough to know the difference between a greeting click and a mockery click. These are mockery clicks. I poured myself another cup of station coffee and waited. There were 4 of them. The lead inspector was named Veth Kareth, according to the badge on his chest plate, tall, copper-scaled, with a flat, forward-angled skull common to the northern caste. He wore an inspection sash over a formal gray tunic and carried a data stylus he kept tapping against his palm in a way that suggested he'd been important for a long time and expected everyone know it. Behind him stood 2 junior assessors, both younger, both doing the same clicking, and a station liaison who looked moderately embarrassed and was choosing to study the floor. Veth Kareth was pointing at the Perseverance's hull profile. He'd zoomed the schematic in on the port side aft panel, which admittedly had been dented since the Meredith survey run 4 years ago, and which I had never gotten around to having properly beaten out. He was clicking steadily, and the 2 junior assessors were clicking in response. And then he said something in Sorth that made all 3 of them produce a sound roughly equivalent to a sustained, appreciative wheeze. The liaison cleared his throat and said, in standard, that the inspector was noting certain deformities in the hull structure consistent with pre-compact era civilian manufacture. I said that was an interesting observation. The liaison nodded carefully, as though I had said something very wise, and translated this back. Veth Kareth made a sound that suggested he found my observation unsurprising, clicked briefly to his junior assessors, and moved on. He pulled up the interior deck plan next. The Perseverance has a main cabin, a small equipment locker, a bunk alcove, and a galley that is technically rated for 1 person if that person is not especially tall and doesn't mind the overhead conduit. Veth Kareth studied this for a moment and then said something that made the junior assessors click again, shorter this time, more dismissive. The liaison translated. The inspector was noting that the crew accommodation appeared to be configured for a single operator. I said yes. He said something else. The liaison said the inspector was observing that this configuration was consistent with the vessel's overall design philosophy. I told the liaison I wasn't sure what that meant. The liaison said, after a pause, that he wasn't entirely sure either. Veth Kareth moved the schematic to the engine assembly. More clicking. He pointed at the relay coupling on the secondary drive, the one I'd replaced at way station Dorothnall, with a part that was technically from a different drive class because the correct part had been backordered for 6 months and I had places to be. The replacement worked fine. It had worked fine for 3 years. It looked, if you were being unkind, like someone had bolted a soup into a turbine housing. The junior assessors were now clicking at a frequency I associated with genuine delight. I took a sip of coffee and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Veth Kareth announced, through the liaison, that the vessel's drive configuration appeared to have been assembled by a method he could only describe as improvisational, that the hull integrity rating would likely not meet conclave way station docking standards, and that the registry markings were. He paused, tapped his stylus, chose his words. Charmingly optimistic, given the state of the vessel. The 2 junior assessors clicked in harmony. I put my cup down. I said, did they want to begin the docking inspection now, or would they like me to sign the consent forms first? Veth Kareth looked at me for a moment as though I'd said something in a language he didn't recognize. Then he said, through the liaison, that the inspection would proceed as scheduled. He nodded to one of the junior assessors, who picked up a certification tablet and began walking toward the corridor that led to Bay 11. I said, pleasantly, that I only asked because of the registry. Veth Kareth paused. I told him the Perseverance was a Class 7 autonomous survey vessel, registered under the Tharvel Compact, the Dorothnall Bilateral, the Meredith Survey Accords, the Kavath Station Operating Agreement, the Greater Conclave Civilian Registry, and 4 additional subsidiary instruments I could list if he liked. I said the running lights on her hull, The ones they've been pointing at in the schematic, the amber ones along the dorsal ridge, were treaty compliance beacons, a Class 7 requirement. They ran a continuous automated record of any interaction occurring within 12 meters of the vessel or in any room where a certified vessel registry was formally on display. I reached into my jacket and set a folded document on the table. I told them that document was the Perseverance's registry certification, which I'd placed on the table before they arrived, as was standard practice under the Kavath Station Operating Agreement, Section 4, Paragraph 9. That meant this room had been within the logging perimeter for the entire duration of our meeting. Veth Kareth looked at the document. I said I also wanted to mention, as a courtesy, that under the Tharvel Compact, any physical inspection of a registered Class 7 vessel without the written consent of the vessel's primary operator triggered an automatic filing with the Conclave Arbitration Board. The system was automated. The filing didn't require me to do anything. It would have gone out the moment his assessor crossed the threshold of Bay 11. I looked at the assessor, who had stopped in the corridor doorway and was looking back at us. I said, he hadn't crossed yet, so we were fine. Veth Kareth set his data stylus down on the table. Very slowly, I opened the consent form, the actual docking inspection consent form, standard conclave template, 2 pages, and slid it across to him. I said I was happy to proceed with the inspection once he'd signed. I said I thought the drive configuration would actually hold up reasonably well under a formal review, given that the replacement coupling had been certified by the Dorathnol Mechanical Registry at the time of installation and the certification was on file. The hull dent was cosmetic. The registry markings were, in fact, not optimistic. They were current, which I thought was the relevant criterion. I said I've been waiting for them to finish before mentioning the logging. I hadn't wanted to interrupt. The liaison had stopped studying the floor. He was now studying the middle distance with the expression of a man who had decided that the safest thing he could do was to have no visible reaction whatsoever. Veth Kareth looked at the consent form for a long moment. He looked at the registry document. He looked at the schematic of the Perseverance still rotating slowly on the projector, the dented aft panel catching the light, the mismatched coupling visible in the engine schematic, the amber running lights blinking their patient, steady, automated blink. He picked up his stylus. He signed the form. I thanked him and told the assessor in the doorway that he could proceed when ready. I refilled my coffee. I told the liaison, who looked like he needed something to do, that there was a second pot on the counter behind him if he wanted any. He got himself a cup. We didn't talk. The 2 junior assessors had gone quiet and were consulting something on their tablets with the studied focus of people who have decided that looking at their tablets is the best available option. Veth Kareth stood at the window that looked out over the docking bays. Bay 11 was visible from here, the Perseverance sitting in her cradle, amber lights blinking. He watched her for a moment. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the beacons hadn't already said more formally and with better documentation. The formal inspection took 47 minutes. The drive coupling passed. The hull dent was logged as cosmetic. The registry markings were confirmed current. The inspection report, when I received my copy, described the Perseverance as an aged but compliant civilian survey vessel operating within all applicable conclave standards. There was no mention of the pre-meeting commentary. The automated log from the treaty compliance beacons sat in the Conclave Arbitration Archive, as it would for the next 30 years, as was standard. I filed the consent form with the station registrar and walked back to Bay 11. The Perseverance looked exactly the same as she always had, dented panel, mismatched coupling, amber running lights blinking steady along the dorsal ridge. I stood there for a minute and looked at her. She'd been doing her job the whole time. I hadn't asked her to. That's just what she did. I thought that was about right.